Step into the cradle of civilization, where the Nile's waters cradled the dreams of pharaohs and the whispers of the past echo through the ages. Are you ready to uncover the mysteries of ancient Egypt? Chapter 1. Drifting Back in Time.
Close your eyes for a moment. Let the sounds of the modern world begin to fade away. We are traveling back, drifting through the centuries, past the rise and fall of empires, past the clamor of the digital age. We are going back to a time before the Great Pyramids cast their long shadows, back before the golden masks of boy kings or the chariots of conquerors. Here the world is quiet, it is raw, it is waiting. Imagine the air, cool and dry, smelling faintly of river silt and wild grasses. The only sound is the rhythmic lap of water against a muddy shore. The sky is a vast, unblemished canvas of indigo, waiting for the sun. This is the dawn of everything. This is the beginning of the two lands. The Great River. At the center of this silence lies a great mystery, a silver thread of water cutting through a world of stone and sand. For thousands of years, this river, the Nile, has been the only constant. It is a lifeline, a gift from the gods to a thirsty earth. Imagine looking down from the heavens at this narrow green sanctuary. To the east and west, the desert stretches forever, the red land, the land of the dead. But here, along the water's edge, is the black land, the fertile, living soul of Egypt. Every year the river swells, bringing with it the rich, dark soil of Africa's heart. It is a cycle as steady as a heartbeat, and because the river was predictable, life became possible. People began to gather. They left the drying plains of the Sahara. They followed the scent of water and the promise of growth. They were hunters, gatherers, and wanderers finding a home. Look closely at the riverbanks as the first light touches the reeds. You see small clusters of huts made of mud and woven papyrus. There are no temples yet, no palaces, no high walls. Just people living in harmony with the rise and fall of the tide. They are learning the language of the soil. They are watching the stars to know when the flood will return. In this simplicity, the seeds of a titan are being sown. The Nile is not just water to them. It is a god named Hapi. It is the breath in their lungs and the grain in their jars. It is the road upon which their history will soon be written. Breathe in that ancient air and feel the stillness. The emergence of society. As the sun begins to crest the horizon, the valley awakens. You see the first smoke rising from hearths in the pre-dynastic villages. Life here moves at the speed of the current. A woman carries a clay jar to the water's edge. A child watches a heron take flight, its wings white against the blue. These are the ancestors, the people of the Nakada and the Badari. They are masters of stone and clay, shaping the earth into tools. They do not know they are ancient Egyptians. They only know the river, the sun, and the family. But notice the subtle changes in their small communities. Some villages are growing larger. Chieftains are rising. They are trading beads of turquoise and copper from distant lands. They are beginning to mark their jars with symbols: a bird, a mountain, a star. These are the first whispers of a written language. They are beginning to think about what happens when the sun goes down, and what happens when a life comes to an end. They bury their loved ones in the sand facing the west. They provide them with pots of food and flint knives for the journey beyond. Even now, at the very beginning, the afterlife is a reality. The desert preserves what the river creates. Feel the weight of this history beneath your feet. The sand is filled with the stories of those who came before. Thousands of years of quiet survival, each generation adding a layer to the foundation of this world. They are building the two lands without even knowing it. The delta in the north, the land of the papyrus. The valley in the south, the land of the lotus. Two distinct worlds united by a single pulsing artery. Hear the wind rustle through the palm fronds. It carries the scent of blooming acacias and wet earth. This is the rhythm of the old world. There is no hurry, there is only the cycle. Morning follows night, flood follows drought. Life follows the river. Peace is the natural state of the valley. The architecture of the soul. As we drift further into the past, look at the landscape again. The mud brick walls are getting thicker, more permanent. The first shrines appear, simple structures with wooden pillars. Inside, they honor the spirits of the wild, the falcon in the sky, the jackal in the desert. The powers of nature are being given names and faces. This is the birth of the Egyptian soul. It is a soul that loves order. It is a soul that fears chaos. They call this order Mot. Mot is the balance of the stars and the flow of the water. To live is to maintain this balance. To work is to honor the great design. Notice the craftsmen sitting in the shade of a sycamore tree. They are polishing palettes of gray siltstone. They are carving images of hunts and processions. Their hands are steady. Their vision is clear. They are creating the aesthetic that will define a nation for 3,000 years. The way they draw a figure, the way they place a line, it is all beginning here in these humble workshops. The river provides the clay, the desert provides the stone, the people provide the spirit. Listen to the distant call of a fisherman on the water. The sound carries far in the still air. Everything feels connected. Everything feels eternal. The threshold of history. We are now approaching the threshold of history, the time of the Scorpion Kings and the legendary unifiers. The villages are merging into states. The chieftains are becoming kingdoms. A sense of destiny is beginning to take hold of the valley. But before we mate the kings, we must understand the land. We must understand the silence of the desert. We must understand the power of the sun as it burns overhead. For it is the land that made the people, not the other way around. Egypt is the gift of the Nile. And as the sun finally rises fully over the eastern cliffs, the gold light floods the valley, turning the river into fire. The shadows retreat, and the world is revealed in all its glory. This is the stage upon which the greatest drama in history will unfold. Stay here for a moment in the warmth of the morning. Feel the continuity of time. The same sun, the same river, the same sand. We are just visitors here, drifting back in time, but the spirit of the Nile remains. It is a story that never truly ends. It is a journey that has only just begun. Let yourself be carried by the current into the heart of the two lands, into the birth of the dynasties. Chapter 2: The Nile River, the heart of early civilization. The miracle of the blue and white. To understand Egypt, one must first understand the journey of the water. It does not begin in the desert, but in the lush, rainy highlands of the south. Thousands of miles away, two great spirits are born. The White Nile, steady and slow, flowing from the Great Lakes of Africa, and the Blue Nile, wild and fierce, carrying the volcanic richness of the Ethiopian mountains. For months they travel across a continent, gathering strength. At Khartoum they meet, a marriage of waters that creates the singular force we know. From that point northward, the river faces its greatest challenge. It must cross 1,500 miles of the world's most unforgiving sand. Most rivers would vanish. They would be swallowed by the heat. But the Nile is defiant. It is a miracle of volume and momentum. It carves a canyon through the limestone, creating a green sanctuary in a world of dust. Without this water, there is no life. There is only the silence of the dunes. The geography of a sanctuary. As the river enters the borders of what we now call Egypt, it changes. It slows down, spreading its arms wide as it approaches the sea. Think of the river as a lotus flower. The long, narrow valley is the stem, stretching for hundreds of miles, and the delta in the north is the blooming flower, spreading into 1,000 veins. This geography dictated the lives of the first people. In the valley, life was a narrow strip. You could stand in the green and throw a stone into the red. In the delta, life was a vast labyrinth of marshes and islands. The river provided everything. It was the highway of the ancient world. Even before the sail was perfected, the current carried travelers north, and the steady northern wind blew them back south. The river was a machine for connection, binding distant tribes into a single culture. The river as a god. The early Egyptians did not see the Nile as a resource. They saw it as a person. They called it Iteru, the great river. They watched its moods with the devotion of a child watching a parent. When the water was clear and high, the gods were pleased. When the river failed to rise, the world itself felt as if it were dying. This dependence created a unique kind of humility. They learned to read the river's secrets. They measured its height on the rocks of Elephantine. They knew that the river brought more than just water. It brought happy, not just the name of a god, but the essence of abundance itself. As we drift further down this ancient stream, let the power of the water settle in your mind. Chapter 3: The Flood Cycle and the Birth of Agriculture. Akhet, the inundation. There is a moment every year when the air begins to change. The heat of the summer remains, but a new scent arrives on the southern wind. It is the smell of wet earth and distant storms. In the height of July, the Nile begins to heave. Slowly at first, then with an unstoppable momentum, the water rises. This was Akhet, the season of the inundation. To the early Egyptians, this was not a disaster to be feared, but a guest to be welcomed. Imagine the valley floors disappearing beneath a shallow, shimmering lake. The villages, built on higher ground, became islands in a vast inland sea. The river brought more than water. It brought the gift of Ethiopia. Suspended in the flood was a fine black volcanic silt, rich with minerals. When the waters eventually receded, they left behind a brand new world, a layer of dark, fertile sludge that was soft enough to be plowed with a branch. Peret, the emergence. As the floodwaters retreated, the season of Peret began. This was the time of the emergence, when the black earth reappeared from the depths. Now the rhythm of the people accelerated. There was no time to waste. The moist earth was a ticking clock. You see them now, men and women walking into the mud. They cast handfuls of emmer wheat and barley onto the damp ground. They do not need complex tools. The river has done the heavy lifting. They guide livestock across the fields to tramp the seeds deep into the silt. This was the birth of true agriculture, not as a struggle against nature, but a dance with it. Simple irrigation channels are dug, like veins, to keep the water flowing to the edges of the desert. This surplus of food changed everything. It meant that for the first time, not everyone had to be a farmer. Shemu, the harvest and the sun. Finally comes Shemu, the season of the harvest and the heat. The green shoots of winter have turned into a sea of golden grain. The air is filled with the sound of flint sickles swishing through stalks. There is a sense of urgency and celebration in the air. Granaries are filled. The abundance is recorded on clay tablets. This predictable cycle created the first sense of time as a circle rather than a line. It gave the Egyptians a profound sense of security. If the river was faithful, the people would flourish. This was the contract that built a civilization, a promise written in mud and fulfilled in gold. As the sun bakes the earth dry, we wait for the cycle to begin again. Chapter 4: The Landscape of Ancient Egypt. The stem and the flower. To live in ancient Egypt was to live between two worlds. In the south, the valley of the upper land was a narrow corridor of life. On either side, massive limestone and sandstone cliffs stood like silent sentinels. Here, the inhabitable earth was often no more than a few miles wide. Beyond those cliffs lay the Red Land, the high, silent plateau of the deep desert. But move north, and the world opens like a palm frond. This is the Delta, the lower land, a vast emerald triangle where the river dissolves. In the Delta, the horizon is endless, and the air is thick with the scent of the sea. It was a labyrinth of papyrus thickets and hidden lagoons. This duality shaped the very soul of the people. They saw their world as a balance, the north and the south, the red and the black. The wild inhabitants. Today, the Nile is quiet, but in the early dynasties, it was a place of wild, dangerous beauty. Massive hippopotami, the river horses, wallowed in the shallows. To the early farmers, they were both a source of meat and a chaotic force that could crush a crop in minutes. Crocodiles basked on the sandbanks, silent and ancient as the stones. Above, the sky was filled with a dizzying array of life. Great white herons, kingfishers, and the sacred ibis moved through the reeds. The early Egyptians watched these animals with a spiritual intensity. They saw the power of the gods reflected in the falcon's dive and the lioness's hunt. The landscape was not just a place to live, it was a living temple. The colors of Kemet. Imagine the colors of this world before the dust of history covered them. The deep, bruised blue of the river at twilight, the shocking neon green of the young barley against the black silt, the brilliant, blinding white of the limestone cliffs under the noon sun, and the ochre, copper, and gold of the surrounding sands. These colors would eventually find their way onto the walls of tombs and the beads of jewelry. The Egyptians were masters of observation. They noticed how the lotus closed at night and opened at dawn, a symbol of rebirth. They saw the sun disk move across the sky and called it a journey. This was a landscape that whispered of eternity in every sunrise. It was a world perfectly ordered, perfectly balanced, a stage set for the arrival of the first kings. Chapter 5: Pre-Dynastic Egypt, Life Before Pharaohs. The First Settlers. Thousands of years before the first stone of a pyramid was cut, Egypt was a land of small, quiet beginnings. These were the people of the Badari and the early Naqada. They were the pioneers of the Nile, the ones who first called the riverbank home. Imagine a world without kings, without taxes, without the weight of an empire. Life was measured by the hearthstone and the family unit. They lived in simple, circular huts made of wattle and daub, nestled near the water. You would see them at dawn, mending nets of flax or grinding grain on flat stones. These people were not primitive. They were masters of their environment. They were the first to domesticate the wild cattle of the plains, and the first to recognize the magic of the annual flood. In these humble villages, the blueprint for Egyptian life was born: community, cooperation, and a deep respect for the rhythm of the earth. The rise of craft and culture. As the generations passed, the villages began to change. They were no longer just surviving, they were creating. We see the emergence of specialized craftsmen, the first true artists of the Nile. They shaped clay into elegant, thin-walled pottery, often painted with scenes of the river, boats with many oars, leaping gazelles, and the tall, swaying palms. They mastered the art of flint knapping, creating knives as sharp as glass and as beautiful as jewelry. This was the Naqada II period, a time of expanding horizons. Trade routes were stretching out like a spiderweb across the sands. Lapis lazuli from the distant mountains of the east, copper from the Sinai, gold from the southern hills. The world was getting smaller, and the villages were getting richer. The seeds of power. With wealth came the first hints of social order. Some graves in the village cemeteries began to look different than others. Some contained ivory combs and silver beads. Others held only a simple pot. We are seeing the birth of hierarchy, the first big men or local chieftains. In the south, at places like Hierakonpolis, the first proto-cities began to form. Here, the first shrines were built of wood and reed, dedicated to a falcon god. The competition between these growing centers was fierce. Ideals of leadership, protection, and divinity were slowly coalescing. The stage was being set for a leader who could unite them all. But for now, the valley remained a mosaic of independent spirits, a vibrant, bustling world on the verge of becoming an empire. Chapter 6: Early Villages, Tools, and Trade. The mastery of stone and clay. To understand the mind of the early Egyptian, one must look at their hands. In the centuries before the first pharaoh, these hands became the most skilled in the ancient world. They mastered the lithic arts, the shaping of stone. Look at the ripple-flaked knife, a miracle of flint, thinned to the width of a leaf. It was not just a tool, it was a statement of precision and patience. At the same time, the potter's wheel was still a dream of the future, yet they hand-coiled jars so symmetrical they seemed to defy gravity. They learned to polish hard stones like basalt and diorite to beautiful, heavy bowls. This required hundreds of hours of grinding with sand and water. These objects were the first luxury goods passed down through generations. They tell us that even then, the Egyptians valued beauty as much as utility. A tool was not just a means to an end, it was a reflection of the cosmic order. The Great Exchange. But no village was an island. The Nile served as a 600-mile conveyor belt for ideas and materials. From the south came gold, the flesh of the gods, and obsidian from the distant coasts. From the north, through the delta, came the first cedar wood from Lebanon and oils from the Levant. Imagine the river crowded with papyrus rafts, their decks piled high with cargo. They traded what they had in abundance, dried fish, grain, and fine linen, for what they lacked, copper for the first chisels, and turquoise for their amulets. Trade was the heartbeat of the valley, forcing distant tribes to speak a common language of commerce. It created a middle class of merchants and sailors, the true connective tissue of the two lands. The innovation of record. As trade grew more complex, memory was no longer enough. They needed a way to mark what belonged to whom. We see the first cylinder seals, borrowed from Mesopotamia but adapted for the Nile. And we see the first clay tokens and labels, the precursors to the written word. A small ivory tag might indicate that a jar contained the finest honey from a specific grove. This was the birth of bureaucracy, long before the first office was ever built. Innovation was everywhere. They were learning to smelt copper in small pit furnaces. They were refining the weave of their linen until it was soft as a cloud. Each tool and each trade route was a brick in the foundation of the state. The people were ready. The economy was booming. All that was missing was a singular vision to hold it all together.
Chapter 7: Beliefs, Burials, and the Earliest Afterlife Ideas. The Western Horizon. Every evening, the early Egyptians watched the sun die. It sank behind the limestone cliffs of the west, leaving a world of shadows. They believed that if the sun could be reborn every morning, then perhaps so could they. The West became the land of the ancestors, the Amenti. At first, their burials were simple, a shallow pit in the dry, scorching sand. The body was placed in a fetal position, as if waiting to be born again. Because the sand was so hot and dry, it did something miraculous. It wicked away moisture before decay could begin, creating natural mummies. When wind or animals uncovered these bodies years later, they were found perfectly preserved. This was the divine spark of their religion. They saw that the physical form could endure, and therefore the soul must endure with it. Nature itself had taught them the secret of immortality. Provisions for the journey. But the soul could not travel alone. It needed tools. It needed food. Even in the earliest graves, we find the vessels of eternity, bowls of dried grain, jars of beer, and flint knives for protection. They buried their dead with their most precious possessions. A child might have a small clay toy. A woman might have an ivory hair comb. This was not just grief, it was a practical preparation for a second life. They believed the Ka, or the life force, required sustenance even after the heart stopped beating. This belief created a powerful social bond between the living and the dead. the living became the caretakers of the ancestors, a tradition that would last 3,000 years. The birth of the gods. In the silence of the desert, the first gods began to take shape. They were not yet human-like figures we see in later temples. They were the forces of the wild, the jackal that roamed the cemeteries at night, the falcon that soared higher than any man could climb. The early Egyptians saw the divine in the eyes of the crocodile and the strength of the bull. They were beginning to build the first shrines, enclosures of wood and reed. Here they offered the first sacrifices to ensure the river would rise. Religion and survival were one and the same. To honor the gods was to keep the desert at bay and the river flowing. The spiritual foundation was laid. The people were unified by a shared fear and a shared hope. Now they only needed a leader who could speak for the gods themselves. Chapter 8. Upper and Lower Egypt, 2 lands, 1 river. The Great Divide. As the populations grew, the Nile Valley split into 2 distinct identities. In the south, the narrow canyon of Upper Egypt forged a people of the mountains and cliffs. They were the Sutbit, the people of the sedge. Their world was linear, rugged, and defined by the high desert walls. To the north, the lower land of the delta was a world of water and horizon. They were the people of the bee, living in a lush, sprawling fan of green. These 2 regions were like 2 different nations, each with its own customs and dialects. Yet they were bound by the same silver thread of the Nile. The south looked toward the heart of Africa. The north looked toward the great green sea. This tension between the 2 lands created a spark of political ambition, a realization that whoever controlled the river's flow controlled the fate of the world. Symbols of identity. Each land claimed its own sacred protector. Upper Egypt was the domain of Nekhbet, the white vulture soaring over the cliffs. Its kings wore the hedjet, the tall white conical crown. Lower Egypt was guarded by Wadjet, the cobra hidden in the papyrus marshes. Its leaders wore the deshret, the red crown with its distinctive curly wire. We begin to see these symbols carved into bone and stone, the lotus for the south, the papyrus for the north. They were more than decorations, they were the first flags of a budding empire. Even in this early age, the concept of dualism was taking root. Everything had a pair, everything needed balance. But as resources grew scarce and trade grew valuable, the 2 lands drifted toward conflict. The chieftains of the south, the followers of Horus, began to look north with hunger. They possessed the gold mines of the desert and the military strength of the highlands. The north possessed the gateways to the sea and the richest farmlands on earth, and collision was inevitable. We see the evidence in Dynasty 0, a time of shadowy kings and battlefield palettes. The 2 lands were waiting for a single hand to grasp both crowns. The dawn of the first empire was approaching, carried on the current of the river. 1 river, 2 worlds, and a singular destiny. Chapter 9. Symbols of Power and Early Kingship. The predator as king. How do you convince a people that one man is chosen by the gods? In the early days, power was not spoken, it was shown through the mask of the predator. The first leaders of the Nile did not call themselves kings. They were the scorpions, the lions, and the falcons. They adopted the strength of the wild to justify their rule. Look at the scorpion macehead, a massive stone weapon carved with the image of a leader holding a hoe. He is both the provider who opens the canals and the warrior who crushes his enemies.
To his belt he pins the tail of a bull, a symbol of raw masculine fertility and power. This was the Ka, the vital force that flowed from the wild into the man. The king was the barrier between the village and the chaos of the desert. The regalia of heaven. As the state grew, the symbols became more refined, more royal. The serek appears, the first frame for a king's name. It represents the facade of a palace, topped by a falcon. This sent a clear message: the god Horus lives within these walls. Then came the shepherd's crook and the flail. The crook signified the king's role as the protector of his flock, the people. The flail signified his power to punish and to reap the harvest. Together they represented the perfect balance of mercy and shadow. These were the artifacts of sovereignty that would remain unchanged for 3,000 years. The living totem. By the end of this era, the king was no longer just a man who led a tribe. He had become a living bridge between the earth and the sky. Every ritual he performed, every canal he dug was a religious act. If the king was strong, the Nile would rise. If the king was weak, the sun would fail. This was the ultimate social contract. We see the followers of Horus moving north, their banners raised high. These banners were totems: the jackal, the ibis, the thunderbolt of Set. Behind these symbols, a single man was emerging from the dust of history, a man who would take the name Narmer and change the world.
Chapter 10. The Unification under King Narmer. The Legend of Narmer. Around 3100 BCE, the time for two worlds was over. From the southern city of Hyrcanopolis, a leader emerged whose name would ripple through eternity. Narmer, the striking catfish. He was not merely a warlord, he was the architect of a new reality. History is captured on a single slab of siltstone, the Narmer palette. On one side, he wears the tall white crown of the south, his arm raised in a smiting pose. He is crushing the resistance of the delta, claiming the lower land by divine right. On the other side, the transformation is complete. He marches in procession, now wearing the red crown of the north. For the first time in human history, one man held the keys to the entire Nile. The two lands had become the land. The marriage of the crowns. Narmer understood that a nation cannot be held by the mace alone. It must be held by the mind and the soul. He created the skent, the double crown, a masterstroke of political branding, the white cone nestled within the red chair. It symbolized a marriage of opposites, the valley and the delta. To solidify this union, he moved the center of gravity. He founded a new city at the balance point of the two regions, Memphis. Legend says he diverted the very path of the Nile to build its white walls. Memphis was the anchor. It was the life of the two lands. From here, the first bureaucracy began to breathe. The dawn of the first dynasty. The unification was more than a political event. It was a cosmic shift. The palette shows two long-necked beasts, their necks intertwined. This is the serpopard, a symbol of the harnessed chaos of a united Egypt. Under Narmer, the local gods were brought into a single pantheon. The king became the lord of the two lands and the high priest of every temple. He was the first to take the title of pharaoh in spirit, if not in name. As Narmer's reign drew to a close, he left behind a blueprint that would last 3,000 years, a centralized state, a divine ruler, and an eternal river. The struggle was over. The civilization had truly begun. The two streams had finally become one. Chapter 11. The Birth of Dynastic Egypt. The concept of a dynasty. With the unification complete, a new concept took root in the fertile soil of Egypt, a dynasty. It was no longer enough for a leader to be strong. Power had to be eternal. The bloodline of the king became a sacred river of its own, flowing from father to son. This transition transformed the nature of the Egyptian state. It moved from a collection of conquered territories to a single living organism. The royal household, or the pharaohs, became the heart of this organism. Within these walls, the first true court was formed, a world of viziers, treasurers, and keepers of the royal seal. Every action of the king was now a matter of national survival. His health was the health of the crops. His stability was the stability of the stars. The dynastic idea provided the people with something they craved above all else: continuity. A promise that even when a king died, the office of the pharaoh would never sleep. The Horus name and the Serach. To cement this new order, the kings of the first dynasty refined their spiritual identity. Each ruler took a Horus name, claiming to be the earthly manifestation of the sky god. We see these names encased in the Serach, a rectangular frame representing the palace gateway. Above the palace sits the falcon, watching over the king's name. This was a powerful visual propaganda. It told every subject that the king was not just a man in a palace, but a god in a temple. This era saw the standardization of Egyptian art and proportions. The way a king stood, the way he held his mace, the way he gazed into the distance, these forms were locked into place, creating a visual language that would remain recognizable for 3 millennia. Consistency became the hallmark of the divine. Beyond the symbols, the first dynasty built the machinery of empire. They established a census to count the people and a system to measure the Nile's height. Tax collectors began to travel the length of the river, gathering grain for the royal granaries. This was the world's first large-scale bureaucracy. It allowed the king to mobilize thousands of people for massive projects, dams, temples, and royal tombs. The two lands were now working in unison, a giant machine powered by the river. We are witnessing the birth of the state as we know it today, a centralized power that provides order in exchange for labor and loyalty. The first dynasty had done more than win a war. They had invented a way of life. The blueprint for eternity was officially signed in the mud of the Nile. Chapter 12. The First Dynasty. Foundations of Rule. The successors of Narmer. With the spark of unification lit, the kings of the first dynasty began the hard work of building an empire. From Hor-Aha to Jir and the great King Den, each ruler added a stone to the foundation of the state. They were warrior kings, leading expeditions into the Sinai for copper and the south for gold. But they were also administrators, carving the first laws into the memory of the people. They established a capital at Memphis, but their hearts remained in the sacred soil of Abydos. Here they built vast funerary complexes that mirrored their earthly palaces. These were the Thinite kings, named for their ancestral home of Thynis. They transformed a conquest into a culture. Under their guise, the first royal court began to flourish, thick with the scent of incense and the sound of scribes. The throne was now the center of the universe. A steady hand was on the tiller, guiding the two lands into the deep waters of history. The shadow of the retainers. In the early First Dynasty, a somber ritual accompanied the death of a king. Surrounding the royal tomb at Abydos, we find hundreds of small, simple graves. These were the retainers, servants, craftsmen, and officials who followed their king into the afterlife. It was a startling display of absolute power, the belief that the king's journey required a court even in death. Imagine the loyalty or the fear required to take that final step alongside a fallen sovereign. However, as the dynasty progressed, this practice faded, replaced by symbolic figurines. The state was maturing, realizing that the living were more valuable to the pharaoh than the dead. This shift marked a change in the Egyptian soul, a move toward mercy and efficiency. The king's power no longer needed the sacrifice of blood. It was cemented in the permanence of stone. The reign of Den and the Hebsed Fest. King Den brought the First Dynasty to its peak. He was the first to be depicted wearing the double crown regularly, and the first to celebrate the Hebsed. This was a ritual of renewal, a physical race run by the king to prove his continued vitality. If the king was fit, the land was fit. We see him on ivory labels, dancing before the gods, reclaiming his right to rule. By the end of the First Dynasty, Egypt was no longer a collection of tribes. It was a machine of stone, grain, and gold, ready to endure for millennia. The foundations were deep. The walls were high. The First Dynasty had passed the torch, leaving behind a kingdom that feared nothing but chaos itself. The blueprint for eternity was complete.
Chapter 13. The Second Dynasty, Stability and Change. The mysterious shift. As the First Dynasty gave way to the Second, the air in Egypt grew heavy with change. The smooth transition of power faltered, and for a time the two lands seemed to pull apart once more. We see a physical shift in the geography of death. Kings began to abandon the ancestral burial grounds of Abydos in the south, moving their massive tombs north to the plateau of Saqqara, overlooking the capital of Memphis. This move was a statement of political intent. The crown was anchoring itself to the heart of the delta. Yet this was a period of internal shadow, a testing of the newly forged union. Administrative records became fragmented. Regional tensions resurfaced like cracks in a drying riverbed. The dream of a unified Egypt was facing its first great trial, a struggle not of conquest, but of identity. The Second Dynasty was the crucible in which the Egyptian state would either shatter or harden. Horus versus Set. This political tension took on a startling religious face. For generations, the king had been the Horus, the celestial falcon.
But midway through the dynasty, a king named Peribsen made a choice that shocked the priesthood. He scrubbed the falcon from his royal sarek and replaced it with the creature of Set. Set was the god of the desert, of storms, and of the red chaos that lay beyond the valley. This was more than a change of patron. It was a religious revolution. It suggests a deep rift between the followers of the South and the factions of the North. For a few turbulent reigns, the two lands were in a symbolic tug-of-war. Chaos, or Isfet, was knocking at the door of the palace. The balance of the universe, the very Ma'at of Egypt, hung in the balance. Kasekem Y, the Great Reconciler. The crisis was finally resolved by the last and perhaps greatest king of the era, Kasekem Y. His name is a victory in itself. The two powerful ones appear. On his royal seal, he performed a masterstroke of diplomacy. He placed both the falcon of Horus and the creature of Set atop his name, crowned and equal. He was the great reconciler, the man who proved that Egypt was big enough for both gods. He crushed the final northern rebellions and turned the nation's energy back toward building. He constructed the Shunet el-Zabib at Abydos, a massive fortress of mud brick that still stands today. These were the largest structures ever built by human hands up to that point. Chapter 14. Early Cities and the Rise of Memphis. The White Walls. At the apex of the delta, where the Nile splits like the fingers of a hand, stood the city of Memphis, known to the ancients as Eneb Hedge, or the White Walls. It was the strategic heart of the unified nation. It was built to be more than a capital, a psychological anchor at the balance point of the two lands. Imagine high whitewashed limestone walls reflecting the blinding sun, visible for miles across the flat plains. Legend says the first king, Menes, diverted the very path of the river to create the dry ground for its foundation. This was the first great act of Egyptian engineering, bending nature to serve the state. Memphis was the crossroads of the world. To the south lay the rugged valley, to the north the gateway to the Mediterranean and the trade of the east. Within these white walls, the scattered tribes of the Nile were forged into a single urban identity. The balance of the two lands was no longer an idea. It was a city of stone and mud, a fortress of order in a world that still remembered chaos. From this urban core, the orders would soon be sent that would reach towards the heavens. The foundations of Memphis were the foundations of the Old Kingdom, a city to last as long as the river itself, a city of scribes and craftsmen. Memphis was not just a seat of power, it was a hive of human ingenuity. Thousands of people lived in its suburbs, granary workers, shipbuilders, weavers, and jewelers. The city was the center of the royal treasury, the counting house for the entire Nile. Scribes moved through the streets with rolls of fresh papyrus, recording every jar of oil and every sack of emmer. It was here that the first complex bureaucracy was perfected. You would hear the constant clink-clink of copper chisels against limestone as masons prepared the blocks for temples. You would smell the cedar wood being imported from the north and the heavy incense from the south. Memphis was a magnet for the talented and the ambitious. It was the first place in history where someone's skill mattered as much as their tribe. The city was a living machine, breathing with the rhythm of the river and the commands of the palace. The religious capital. Memphis was also the home of Ptah, the creator god, the divine architect who spoke the world into existence. To the people of Memphis, the physical act of building was a form of prayer. Every wall raised, every canal dug, was seen as an echo of Ptah's original creation. As the city grew, its temples became the intellectual heart of the kingdom. Priests and philosophers debated the nature of the soul and the movement of the stars. Memphis became the template for every great city that would follow in the ancient world. It was a testament to what a unified people under a single vision could achieve. The white walls did not just keep enemies out, they kept the future in. From this urban core, the orders would soon be sent that would reach towards the heavens. The foundations of Memphis were the foundations of the Old Kingdom, a city to last as long as the river itself. Chapter 15. Writing, Record-Keeping, and Hieroglyphs. The Words of the Gods. In the quiet workshops of Memphis and the sacred shrines of Abydos, a miracle was taking shape. It was the Medu Neter, the words of the gods. To the early Egyptians, writing was not merely a way to communicate, it was an act of creation. To draw a bird was to give that bird life. To carve a name was to grant that person immortality. At first, these symbols were simple pictures, a mouth, a water ripple, a mountain. But as the state grew, these symbols evolved into a complex system of sounds and ideas. Hieroglyphs became the ultimate bridge between the physical and the spiritual. They were the tools that allowed the king to speak across the miles and across the centuries. This was not a language of the common people, but a sacred code of the elite, a secret shared between the scribes, the kings, and the heavens, a script designed to be carved in stone and to last as long as the mountains themselves. The scribe, the hand of the state. While the king sat on his throne, the scribe sat on the floor, his legs crossed, his reed pen ready. The scribe was the muscle of the Egyptian bureaucracy. Without him, the empire would have been nothing more than a collection of uncounted grain and forgotten promises. Imagine the intense training of a young boy in the house of life, copying texts for hours, learning the hundreds of signs that governed the universe. He carried his tools in a simple wooden palette, 2 wells of ink, black for the body of the text, red for the headings. He recorded the taxes, the boundaries of the fields after the flood, and the rations for the pyramid workers. To be a scribe was to be exempt from hard labor. It was a life of the mind, a position of immense respect and quiet power. The pen was mightier than the mace. The record was more permanent than the flesh. From clay to papyrus. The evolution of writing was also an evolution of material. While the most important words were carved in limestone or ivory, the daily business of Egypt was written on the marsh. The papyrus plant, growing in abundance in the delta, was the world's first paper. Workers stripped the stalks, layered them, and hammered them into smooth, flexible sheets. These scrolls could be rolled, stored, and transported easily up and down the Nile. This allowed for a centralized government that could manage 1,000 miles of river from a single room. Record-keeping became an art form. In the silence of the royal archives, the history of the first dynasties was carefully preserved. Every harvest, every war, and every royal decree was captured in ink. The Egyptians had conquered time itself by turning the spoken breath into the written word. A legacy was being born, one that we are still reading today. Chapter 16. The Pharaoh as a Living God. The Incarnation of Horus. In the minds of the early Egyptians, the king was not a man who represented God. He was God. From the moment of his coronation, the pharaoh ceased to be a mere mortal and became the living Horus. He was the falcon who had descended to earth to bring order to the chaos of the valley. This was the central mystery of the Egyptian state, the belief in a divine incarnation. When the pharaoh walked, the gods walked. When he spoke, the universe listened. This divinity was not a gift of vanity, but a heavy burden of responsibility. The king was the only being who could stand between the people and the terrifying forces of nature. He was the guarantor of the sunrise and the master of the inundation. To look upon his face was to glimpse the eternal. He was the sun disk's shadow on the earth, the bridge between the mud and the stars. The ritual of majesty. Every movement of the pharaoh was governed by a strict, sacred rhythm. His daily life was a series of rituals designed to keep the world in balance. In the morning, he entered the sanctuary to awaken the gods through prayer and incense. He wore the uraeus, the golden cobra, upon his brow, ready to spit fire at the enemies of truth. Even his clothing was a map of the cosmos, the lion's tail for strength, the white linen for purity. He did not rule in the modern sense. He performed the office of existence. He was the high priest of every temple, the ultimate judge of every crime. Because he was divine, his will was law, and his law was the echo of the divine plan. To serve the pharaoh was to serve the very fabric of reality. To rebel against him was to invite the desert to swallow the world. The eternal presence. This divine status did not end with death. When a pharaoh passed into the horizon, he did not vanish, he transformed. He became Osiris, the lord of the dead, while his son became the new Horus on the throne. This created a perfect, unbreakable circle of life and power. The king's presence was felt in every corner of the two lands, even in villages he would never visit. His name was carved into the rocks of the furthest deserts, a protective spell over the land. He was the shepherd of the people, the one who ensured that grain was in the jars and peace was in the home. As we look back at the early dynasties, we see the absolute scale of this devotion, a nation of millions moving as one, dedicated to the service of a single living God. It was a devotion that would build monuments to defy the very concept of time. The king was Egypt, and Egypt was the king. Chapter 17. Ma'at, Order, Balance, and Harmony. The invisible architecture. If the pharaoh was the heart of Egypt, then Ma'at was its soul. Ma'at was not just a goddess, she was the invisible architecture of the universe. She was the truth that allowed the sun to rise, the justice that guided the judge, and the rhythm that brought the flood. To the early Egyptians, the world was a fragile place, always threatened by Isfet, the swirling forces of chaos. Ma'at was the barrier. She was the perfect state where everything was in its proper place. Every person, from the highest vizier to the humblest field hand, had a role in maintaining this balance. To live with Ma'at was to live in harmony with the neighbors, the river, and the gods. It was the first great social contract, a belief that moral behavior was the glue holding the cosmos together. Without Ma'at, the stars would fall from the sky and the Nile would turn to dust. Life was a sacred duty of preservation. Balance was not a choice, it was the law of existence. The weight of a heart. This concept of balance extended beyond the grave and into the very halls of judgment. The Egyptians believed that at the end of a life, one's heart would be weighed on a scale. On the other side of the scale sat the feather of Ma'at, a single delicate ostrich plume. If the heart was heavy with lies, greed, or cruelty, it would sink, and the soul would be lost. But if the heart was as light as the feather, it meant the person had lived a life of truth. This profound idea introduced a moral weight to every daily action. Speaking the truth was not just a virtue, it was a survival strategy for eternity. We see this reflected in the early wisdom texts, the first instructions on how to be a good man. Do not be proud of your knowledge, they taught, but listen to the ignorant as much as the wise. Justice was seen as a cooling water that satisfied the thirsty land. The eternal cycle. Ma'at was the reason the Egyptian civilization endured for so long. It created a society that valued stability over change and continuity over revolution. The pharaoh was the supreme guardian of Ma'at. His primary job was to repel Isfet and bring Ma'at. We see him in early carvings, offering a tiny figure of the goddess to the greater gods. It was a symbolic gesture. I have kept the world as you intended it to be. As long as the king and the people walked the path of Ma'at, Egypt was invincible. This was the peace of the valley, a quiet, steady confidence in the order of things. The river would flow, the grain would grow, and the sun would return. The feather of truth was the lightest thing in the world, yet it supported the weight of an entire empire. Ma'at was the breath of life, eternal and unchanging. Chapter 18. Daily Life Along the Nile. The texture of the everyday. Away from the gold of the palaces and the incense of the temples, another Egypt existed. This was the Egypt of the mud-slicked riverbank and the dusty village square. For the average person in the early dynasties, life was defined by the reach of the river. Homes were built from the very earth they farmed.
sun-dried mud bricks mixed with straw. These houses were cool sanctuaries against the relentless sun, with flat roofs where families slept on hot summer nights. Inside, furniture was sparse, a few woven mats, a low wooden stool, and a clay hearth. Life began before the sun rose. You would hear the sound of women grinding emmer wheat into flour, the rhythmic thud-thud echoing through the village. You would smell the sour, sweet aroma of leavened bread baking in clay ovens. This was a world of simple needs and profound connections. Every object, a water jar, a flint knife, a linen tunic, was made by hand and kept for a lifetime. The river's bounty. The Nile was the supermarket of the ancient world. Men waded into the marshes with harpoons and nets, bringing home tilapia, perch, and catfish. In the small garden plots behind the houses, they grew leeks, onions, garlic, and lentils. Dates and figs provided a rare, sugary treat. Beer was the staple of life, thick, nutritious, and safer to drink than the river water. It was consumed by everyone, from the laborers to the priests, at every meal. Clothing was a matter of function and climate. Simple loincloths for the men and sheath dresses for the women, all made of white flax. To stay clean was a religious duty. They washed multiple times a day in the river. They used oils infused with flowers to protect their skin from the desert wind. Even in poverty, there was a sense of grace and dignity. The evening hearth. When the sun finally dipped below the western cliffs, the pace of the village slowed. Families gathered in their small courtyards as the air began to cool. This was the time for storytelling, passing down the legends of the gods and the deeds of the ancestors. Children played with carved wooden lions or clay dolls with hair made of mud beads. There was a deep sense of community. A village was an extended family. They shared their tools, their grain, and their grief. Though their lives were hard and their work was backbreaking, they were part of something eternal. They lived in the center of a world that worked, a world where the gods were present in every reed. As the fires died down to embers, a quiet peace settled over the valley. The river continued to flow in the darkness, a constant guardian of their dreams. The day was over, and the land of Kemet was at rest.
Chapter 19. Family, Food, and Social Roles. The fabric of the family. At the heart of the Nile civilization was the family, the foundation upon which all other structures were built. In early Egypt, the family was an intimate circle, a mirror of the cosmic balance of Ma'at. Men and women held distinct but complementary roles. Women in the early dynasties enjoyed a level of legal independence unseen in many other ancient cultures. They could own land, manage businesses, and represent themselves in court. As mistress of the house, a woman was the governor of the domestic sphere, ensuring the lineage remained strong. Children were seen as a blessing from the gods, the staff of old age, who would care for their parents in life and maintain their tombs in death. To have a large family was to be wealthy in the eyes of the community. Success was measured by the harmony of the home and the continuation of the name through the generations. The flavors of the two lands. What did it taste like to live in the age of the first kings? The Egyptian diet was a celebration of the river's generosity. Bread and beer were the pillars, the daily bread that sustained the worker and the prince alike. But the table of a prosperous family was much richer. Honey, harvested from clay fives in the delta, was the primary sweetener, prized as the tears of the sun god. They feasted on roasted duck, goose, and the tender meat of the gazelle. Vegetables were plentiful: crunchy radishes, sweet peas, and cooling cucumbers. Dining was a sensory experience, often accompanied by the sound of the harp or the flute. Food was not just fuel, it was an offering. A portion of every meal was set aside for the ancestors, keeping the connection between the living and the dead alive through the scent of roasted meat. The hierarchy of the valley. As the state grew, so did the complexity of social roles. Egypt was a pyramid of human effort, with the pharaoh at the apex. Below the royal house stood the nobles and the priesthood, the keepers of law and spirit. Then came the middle tier, the skilled artisans, the scribes, and the physicians, but the vast majority of the people were the farmers, the true Egyptians, whose labor fueled the entire machine. Social mobility was rare, but not impossible. A talented scribe could rise to become a vizier. Everyone understood their place in the divine order. The farmer did not envy the scribe, for the scribe could not till the earth, and the farmer could not write the stars. This acceptance of one's role provided a profound sense of stability. It was a society where everyone was a part of a single, breathing organism, bound together by the river, the blood, and the bone. Chapter 20. Work, Seasons, and the Rhythm of Time. The 3 pillars of the year. To the early Egyptians, time was not a straight line moving toward an unknown end. It was a circle, a wheel that turned with the steady pulse of the Nile. They divided their year into 3 seasons of 4 months each, a calendar dictated by the river. First came Akhet, the inundation, when the fields vanished under water and the farmers became builders for the king. Then Peret, the emergence, when the mud was sown with the promise of life. And finally Shemu, the harvest, when the heat of the sun turned the valley to gold. This rhythm created a profound sense of security. Even in years of hardship, the people knew that the cycle would eventually reset. They did not fight against time, they lived within it, like fish in a current. The rising of the star Sirius, the celestial herald of the flood, was their New Year's Day, a moment when the heavens and the earth aligned in perfect harmony. The labor of the sun. Work was not seen as a burden, but a contribution to the maintenance of Mot. During the flood months, when the fields were inaccessible, the great corvée labor began. This was the time when the pharaoh called upon his people to build the eternal monuments. They were not slaves, but a national workforce, paid in bread, beer, and the spiritual merit of serving a god. Imagine thousands of men singing in rhythm as they hauled limestone blocks on wooden sleds. Under the scorching sun, the sheer scale of human cooperation was breathtaking. In the planting season, the work shifted to the domestic and the delicate, digging irrigation canals, guiding the water with simple buckets, and protecting the young sprouts from birds. The rhythm of the hoe replaced the rhythm of the sled. Every hour of the day had its purpose, measured by the shadow of a simple sundial. The eternal return. As the seasons turned, the Egyptian mind developed a unique perspective on aging and legacy. They saw their lives as part of a grander, repeating story. Just as the moon waned and waxed, and the sun died and was reborn, so too would they. This cyclical view removed the sting of the passing years. Old age was respected as a time of wisdom, the harvest of a life. They celebrated festivals at the turn of every season, communal dances, drinking, and offerings. These were the heartbeats of the community, moments where the community paused to acknowledge the gift of time. Chapter 21: Early Temples and Ritual Practices. The House of the God. In the early dynasties, the temple was not a place for a congregation to gather. It was the hut neter, the literal house of the god. Long before the colossal stone pylons of Karnak, these sanctuaries were humble, organic structures, built of woven reeds, timber, and mud brick. They mimicked the primeval mound that first rose from the waters of chaos. At the center, in the deepest shadow, sat the shrine of the deity. Only the pharaoh and the highest priests could cross the threshold into this sacred darkness. The air here was heavy with the scent of the Eye of Horus, sacred frankincense imported from the distant land of Punt. To enter the temple was to leave the world of men and step into the timeless realm of the gods. Here, the spirit of the god resided within a cult statue, a physical vessel for a cosmic power. The temple was the battery that powered the nation. The daily ritual. The gods, like the people, required care and nourishment to maintain Ma'at. Every morning, as the sun's first rays hit the sanctuary, the high priest performed the opening of the mouth. He broke the clay seal on the shrine doors and stood before the statue of the god. He washed the image with pure water, anointed it with sacred oils, and dressed it in fine linen. Then came the offerings, the finest cuts of meat, fresh bread, lilies, and jars of wine. Through these gestures, the priest was not just feeding a statue, he was sustaining the universe. Music was a vital part of this divine conversation. The rattling of the sistrum, a sacred bronze instrument, was believed to soothe the gods and drive away evil spirits. The temple was a place of perpetual sound and movement, a living bridge between the earth and the sky. The sacred pools and beyond. Purity was the currency of the temple. Every priest had to bathe in the sacred lake, a stone-lined pool within the temple, 4 times a day. They shaved their bodies to ensure no impurity could touch the divine space. Outside the main sanctuary, the temple functioned as a library, a hospital, and a laboratory. Priests studied the stars to predict the flood and mixed medicines from honey and herbs. They were the guardians of the collective memory, the keepers of the myths that defined what it meant to be Egyptian. As the first and second dynasties flourished, these reed shrines slowly began to transform into stone. The temporary became permanent. The wood became limestone. The early temples set the stage for the massive stone monuments that would eventually dominate the skyline. In the silence of the shrine, the seeds of the Old Kingdom were already beginning to bloom. The gods were home, and the land was safe.
Chapter 22: Art and Architecture of the Early Dynasties. The birth of a visual language. In the workshops of the early dynasties, the Egyptians were doing something revolutionary. They were creating a visual language that would remain unchanged for 3,000 years. Art was not an expression of the individual, it was an expression of the eternal. It was during this era that the canon of proportions was born, a grid system that dictated exactly how a human figure should be drawn: the shoulders, the feet, the gaze. This was the birth of Egyptian formalism, the combination of profile and frontal views that captured the essence of a person. Sculpture, too, began to emerge from the stone. We see the first royal statues, carved from hard siltstone and limestone, with wide, watchful eyes and powerful, square shoulders. These images were not meant to be pretty, they were meant to be true. They were vessels for the soul, designed to endure long after the flesh had failed. The architecture of eternity. While the living dwelt in houses of mud and reed, the dead required the permanence of the mansion of eternity. This era saw the rise of the mastaba, a massive bench-shaped tomb made of mud brick. These were the ancestors of the pyramids, rectangular structures with sloping sides and flat roofs. The exteriors were often decorated with palace facade niches, a complex play of light and shadow that mimicked the royal residence. Inside, the mastabas were honeycombed with rooms for offerings and treasures, but the true innovation was hidden deep below the earth. For the first time, architects were beginning to experiment with stone, using limestone blocks for flooring and portcullis doors. They were learning the language of weight and gravity. They were building not for a season, but for 1,000,000 years. The beauty of the small. Beyond the towering tombs, the early Egyptians were masters of the miniature. They transformed the hardest stones, basalt, diorite, and porphyry, into jars and bowls of breathtaking elegance. Without the potter's wheel, they hollowed out these stones using only copper drills and abrasive sand. The walls of these vessels were often as thin as a fingernail, yet they have survived 5,000 years. Jewelry also reached a peak of sophistication. They worked in gold, carnelian, lapis lazuli, and turquoise, creating intricate bracelets and necklaces. Every bead was a symbol, every color was a prayer. As the second dynasty drew to a close, the Egyptian artist had mastered every medium. They had turned the raw materials of the Nile into a mirror of the divine. The stage was set for the architects of the Old Kingdom to take these lessons and reach for the sky. The blueprint of beauty was complete. Chapter 23. Science, Medicine, and Early Astronomy. The stars as a map. For the early Egyptians, the sky was not a void, but a mirrored reflection of the Nile itself. In the crystal-clear desert nights, they observed the movements of the indestructible stars, the circumpolar stars that never set. This was the birth of Egyptian astronomy, a science born from the need to predict the future. They noticed that the rising of the dog star, Sirius, coincided exactly with the arrival of the flood. Using simple tools like the merkit, a sighting instrument made of a palm rib, they mapped a heavens. They were the first to divide the night into 12 hours and the year into 365 days. This was more than timekeeping. It was an attempt to align the works of man with the geometry of the gods. Every temple was oriented to the cardinal points with a precision that still baffles the modern eye. To know the stars was to know the mind of the Creator. The wisdom of the body. While they looked to the stars for timing, they looked to nature for healing. Early Egyptian medicine was a unique blend of practical observation and spiritual magic. Because they practiced the preservation of the dead, they gained an unrivaled understanding of human anatomy. They knew the importance of the pulse, calling it the speech of the heart. we see the first surgeons using copper scalpels, needles, and linen bandages. They treated fractures with wooden splints and used honey, a natural antibiotic, to heal wounds. Their pharmacopoeia was vast: willow leaves for pain, garlic for strength, and castor oil for digestion. A physician was often a priest as well, believing that a cure required both a poultice for the body and a spell for the soul. In this era, the distinction between science and religion did not exist. Everything was a part of a single living truth. The geometry of the earth. Science also extended to the very ground they walked on. Every year the flood wiped away the boundaries of the fields. This forced the Egyptians to become the world's first master surveyors and mathematicians. They developed a system of measurement based on the human body, the cubit, the span, and the digit. Using knotted ropes, they mastered the art of the right angle and the calculation of areas. This earth measuring was the foundation of geometry. They calculated the volume of granaries and the slope of irrigation canals with startling accuracy. As the second dynasty closed, the Egyptian mind had mastered the tools of logic and observation. They had learned to measure the water, the land, and the stars. They were no longer merely surviving the world, they were calculating its secrets. The age of the great engineers was about to begin. Chapter 24: International Relations and Trade. Beyond the borders. Ancient Egypt was never a silent island in the desert. Even in the early dynasties, the pharaohs looked beyond the horizon, driven by a hunger for resources that the Nile could not provide. This was the era of the first great expeditions, journeys into the unknown that transformed Egypt into a regional power. To the east, across the shimmering heat of the Sinai, lay the turquoise and copper mines. To the south, beyond the churning rapids of the First Cataract, was Nubia, the gateway to the exotic riches of deep Africa. These were not just trade missions, they were displays of royal manifest destiny. We see the names of the first kings carved into the rocks of distant mountain passes, marking the territory where the Egyptian foot had stepped. The two lands were reaching out, beginning to touch the wider world. The cedar and the sea. While the deserts were crossed by donkey caravans, the sea was conquered by the first Egyptian fleets. The pharaohs had a desperate need for a material their own land lacked: high-quality timber. The native acacia and palm were too soft for the great projects of the state, and so they turned their eyes towards the northern coast, to the forests of Byblos in modern Lebanon. Enormous ships, built of local wood but designed for the Mediterranean, returned laden with towering trunks of cedar. Along with the wood came jars of fragrant oils, silver, and the first ideas from the civilizations of the East. The ports of the Delta became vibrant multilingual hubs of exchange. Egypt was learning that its wealth could buy the world. The luxury of the gods. Trade was not just about building materials, it was about the pursuit of the divine. The gods of Egypt demanded the finest offerings, and these often came from thousands of miles away. Lapis lazuli, with its deep blue like the night sky, traveled from the distant mountains of Afghanistan. From the mysterious land of Punt came the tears of the gods, frankincense and myrrh. This global network was the bloodline of the early Egyptian elite. The presence of a single blue bead or a scent of exotic resin in a tomb was a testament to the pharaoh's reach. This exchange of goods was also an exchange of culture. Egyptian pottery has been found in the sands of Palestine. Mesopotamian seals have been found in the mud of the Nile.
Chapter 25: The Transition to the Old Kingdom. The end of the beginning. Every great river has its rapids before it reaches the deep, steady flow of the sea. For the early dynastic period, the reign of Khâsekhemoui served as the final grand bridge. The era of the two lands as a fragile, experimental union was coming to an end. The struggles of the Second Dynasty had forced the state to innovate, to centralize, and to dream on a larger scale. We see the shift in the very soil of Saqqara. The mud brick mastabas were growing larger, more complex, but the material was reaching its limit. Mud brick, though versatile, was a child of the earth. It could crumble, it could wash away. The pharaohs were now looking for something that could withstand the weight of eternity. A new generation of thinkers was emerging, led by the enigmatic figure of Djoser. The stage was set for a transformation that would change the skyline of the world forever. The proto-dynastic twilight was fading, and the brilliant sun of the Old Kingdom was about to rise. The arrival of the stone. The transition was marked by a single revolutionary material, dressed limestone. Under the guidance of the legendary vizier and architect Imhotep, the rules of construction were rewritten. They moved away from the temporary, the reed, the wood, and the sun-dried mud. They began to petrify the world, carving the forms of plants and tents into the living rock. This was the birth of the Third Dynasty, the true dawn of the Pyramid Age. The first step pyramid was not a sudden invention, but a vertical stacking of the ancient mastabas. It was a stairway to heaven, built of stones so precisely cut they needed no mortar. This shift required a level of national organization never before seen on Earth. Tens of thousands of workers, fed by the surplus of the Nile, moving in a coordinated dance of labor. The state had become a godlike force of nature itself. The legacy of the first 3 centuries. As we look back across the first 500 years of a unified Egypt, the achievement is staggering. They had invented a script that could record the soul, a religion that could balance the stars, and a government that could survive the death of a king. They had turned a collection of river tribes into the most sophisticated society on the planet. The two lands were the roots of the great tree. Without the unification of Narmer, there would be no Khufu. Without the bureaucracy of the Second Dynasty, there would be no Giza. The foundation was solid, the culture was set in its ways, the gods were satisfied. Egypt was no longer a place, it was an idea, a vision of order, beauty, and permanence that would remain the envy of the world for 3,000 years. The pioneers had done their work. The Golden Age was here. The river flows on, carrying the memory of the first kings into the light of the pyramids. Chapter 26: Conclusion and Legacy. The echoes of the beginning. We have traveled 3,000 years back to the source, to the mud and the light of the early Nile. What we found there was not a primitive people, but a masterpiece of human organization. The early dynastic period was the laboratory of civilization. It was here that the fundamental questions of humanity were first answered in stone. How do we live together? How do we conquer death? How do we honor the earth that feeds us? The legacy of the first kings is not just found in the museums of Cairo or London.
It is found in the very way we measure time, the way we govern states, and the way we seek order in a chaotic world. They gave us the first bureaucracy, the first national identity, and the first written history. They proved that a vision held by many could literally move mountains. The two lands may have passed into myth, but their heartbeat remains. The eternal river. The Nile continues to flow, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires. But for those few centuries at the dawn of time, the river and the people were in perfect sync. The early Egyptians did not see themselves as masters of the river, but as its partners. They understood that civilization is a delicate balance, a dance between the water and the silt. As we look at the ruins of Abydos or the walls of Saqqara, we see a message sent across the ages. It is a message of hope that through labor, art, and faith, we can create something that lasts. The symbols they created, the falcon, the lotus, the crown, still speak to us. They remind us of a time when the world was young and the possibilities were as endless as the delta. Egypt was the first great experiment, and it succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The immortal name. The ancient Egyptians believed that a man lived as long as his name was spoken. By rediscovering the stories of Narmer, Den, and Khasek-Hemwi, we have given them new life. Their names are no longer silent marks on a dusty stone. They are the architects of our shared history. We end our journey where it began, at the edge of the river at twilight. The sun sets in the west, in the land of the ancestors, but we know it will return. This is the gift of Egypt, the certainty of the cycle, the beauty of the balance, and the triumph of the spirit. The first chapters of the human story were written here in the black silt of the Nile, and though the ink has dried, the words are still clear. Behold, the stones seem to say, we were here, we built, we dreamed, we endured. The light of the pharaohs will never truly fade, for as long as the Nile flows, Egypt is eternal.